This video is a good way for me to think through a lot of my past experiences as a failure in entrepreneurship and things to learn from that, and also for you to learn vicariously through that failure to avoid the mistakes that I've made and be able to glean a lot of wisdom from that. I think that having one case study, such as myself, across multiple ventures is exponentially more valuable than reading separate case studies because with wisdom and vicarious experience, knowing more and more context about the situation and about the person and about their differences to you makes the difference night and day between whether or not it's valuable and if you can extract anything out of that. For example, with quotes, you can have absence makes the heart grow fonder, or you could say out of sight, out of mind. And vicariously, they both seem like kind of smart things, but they're completely contradictory and totally useless unless you have some sort of frame to apply those to. So without further ado, I'm going to go through a chronological order of the main startups that I've worked on and what I've learned from those about entrepreneurship and myself as a way for you to get yourself thinking and to be able to take those lessons and decide how they relate to you or when they'd be applicable. And then to end with an overall point on the main lessons that I took away and how I can learn from those and how I'm currently applying them to my current startup. The first startup I worked on is Red Cups, and that was when I was in school. It was reusable party cups. Nobody had ever used the word red cups before. So I had reusable ones made, had shop measurements, tons of different colors. There were a lot of benefits. And I got really into the company, got some money from friends, started doing that. And since nobody had used the term before, I got #1 Google placement for that, as well as for a lot of mixed drinks, drinking games, and party themes because I made an encyclopedia for people to add things to. It was starting to become very good passive income. And it all came tumbling down when I lost my website. I had a friend who owned a web hosting company that I was using. He sold it and asked people to back up their data. I didn't get that because I didn't have my school email address anymore. And suddenly I lost the Google ranking, and I also lost my website because I didn't back up my data. So that's an important lesson, is if there's something that your entire business hinges on, as with my case, it was all direct-to-consumer sales, really analyze if there's something that's really important and how you can protect that, because that was really stupid of me back then. Now there's a thing called GitHub that I would be using as a developer to store all the data on a server at least, so that I could at least get the website back. And if you pop it up that quickly, I doubt it would really affect the Google rankings. Back then, that crashed the company. Another thing that I didn't take quite advantage of was realizing that I needed help with sales to stores, large bulk sales. Now there's a lot of companies doing Red Cups, and a lot of them multi-million-dollar companies. And I was the first one that easily could have had all that brand. But I just realized that I like marketing, I like building a product and designing and analyzing things, but I didn't want to do the direct sales, and I didn't have experience selling to stores or through distribution networks. And so hiring somebody, getting a co-founder, even if the website went down, would have really helped that process and could have kept the company not only alive, but to be much bigger. Whereas now it's something I shut down. It could have been something that could have already made me a millionaire at this point. And so that's an important lesson. The last thing is that I lost a lot of motivation to work on the project. I personally, for myself, am extremely ambitious, and I expect myself to become a billionaire at some point in my life. And it's unrealistic for most people, but for me, realizing after I'd started Red Cups that it was a sort of product that isn't resellable, like toothpaste or chewing gum or Coca-Cola, and it isn't a big ticket item like a car, the amount of profit you can get per customer actually isn't that high. And my sister's facing a similar problem with her company Hinky Books, which are reusable handkerchiefs, and in that you sell one to somebody and it's not something they're constantly throwing away like Kleenexes, or it's not a big ticket item. So realizing that that's a type of business, it's better to go in with a mentality of building it up and selling it to somebody who has a bigger product line, or if you're like me, then maybe even avoiding it altogether, knowing that it couldn't become a really big thing. Next is Addendum 13. It's a video game that I was leading development of with a team of people around the world, as well as a TV show about a video game where myself and a friend would be playing on the highest difficulty possible. The previous game in that series had won Game of the Year, and we thought that doing a TV show with professional historians and personalities narrating them and making it sort of an adventure and getting endorsement from the company would work. And then in both these projects, I got a lot of people and a lot of elements together. I recruited Dan Carlin, who has the world's most popular history podcast, Gregory Aldrete, who was Classics Professor of the Year and has done some very widely renowned lectures. And while I was trying to do both of these at the same time, I was also attending Dev Bootcamp learning how to code. And that by itself is way too much work for anything else. And by trying to split my attention in many different ways and even having a social life was way too much. And I learned a lesson that has really stayed with me, is don't do too many things at once. I was at a Y Combinator barbecue where an investment bank had thrown it for a lot of different people, and I'd kind of been dragged there early on in the Bay Area. And I remember something that really offended me was talking to a guy there about the things I was doing. I thought it was made sense and I was being really clever trying to juggle all these things. But he said that you should really only focus on one thing, and I think the reason it offended me is because deep down I maybe knew that was true. And hopefully you can learn from me and not have to throw away some really cool companies, really cool ideas, fun things, opportunities from trying to do too many at once. And by putting all your eggs in one basket, you also obsess over the basket and you think about that when you're not working on it, and you get a lot more momentum around that. The next company is Nuvo. That was my first more serious company that had other people involved, a bigger customer base, wider reach. It was also my first tech company that I'd ever worked with. And something with that is that being a more complicated company, I made a lot of mistakes early on. Changed technology stack 3 times. And what that can mean for you is know that your first time is going to be a learning experience. Try to learn on somebody else's dime if you can. Have a co-founder to share the pains of loss, or use somebody else's money. Join a startup maybe before you start your own, because there will be a lot of mistakes of things that you don't know and that you can't even consider. There's so many things that I probably still don't know that a lot of people know, but there's also things I don't know that they don't know. But the longer you wait and the more experience you get, the less of that there is that falls between the gaps, and the more well-rounded and holistic decisions you can make, such as knowing what technologies to use. The next lesson in Nuvo is I tried raising money too early. A couple of years beforehand, it was possible to raise money on an idea. I thought that was possible because I'd read about it. I'd read articles of case studies of it happening, but it's actually not the case anymore that you can raise money on an idea unless you have some sort of intellectual property that's really strong and defendable, or you have a super kick-ass team that has exited before, top-notch background and credentials and expertise. When I started Nuvo, neither of those were strong enough the case to raise money, so I ended up wasting weeks of a process, which early on can make you lose a lot of momentum and costs a lot, trying to raise money when it was essentially impossible to do without having traction. So unless you have those other elements, or a lot of traction, sales, growth, something like that, you're not going to be able to get a company funded. And if that's something that your company is dependent on, don't even try to raise funding until those are done. If you can't get those done, don't even pursue that idea because it's a waste of time. The next thing I learned from my experience with Nuvo, by the way, it was a fashion advice app. At the time, there weren't really any where you could post a picture or two, get opinions, people like this one, that one, listing comments from strangers. Now it's a wider idea, and since I started it, there's about 6 or 7 companies doing it. But a lot of the first time experience caused me to make bad technology decisions that made our time to market a lot longer than it could have been. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I wasn't passionate enough to compete with a lot of companies when we weren't differentiated enough or have some sort of big advantage. Another thing that would have rounded that out is having an expert co-founder, whether it be in tech or the fashion industry, or ideally both. Having a strong co-founder to make up for those weaknesses of yours will save you a lot of time, as it could have with me with the Nuvo app. I had somebody else that knew how to code, but they weren't widely experienced or knowing more than I could. They didn't exceed me as a master in that subject. And if they had, then maybe we would have not made early bad technology decisions that would require us to do work again later. The last thing in Nuvo that I'd like to share is that I tried to make it as fair of a company as possible by allowing people to work for equity and to be able to keep the majority of the equity even if they left the company. And I thought that kind of like a company with shares, the more shares that go in, the more work that gets done, the bigger the pie. And as people join the company, they could increase their value over time. Problems with that are that it creates a lot of communication that's unnecessary. If you have too many people with equity that vest, or if they leave, it's disheartening to know that a lot of other people are having the equity. And it's also harder to know that going into the company for new people, that if there's other people with large amounts, or that you're starting off small at the very beginning and you don't have much, it's not very inspiring. So a takeaway from that is to have the equity vest over time more, at least 2 to 4 years before people actually get the ownership in something, and that even though it's slightly less fair in a way, a lot of the value comes from what something becomes over time. And in often cases, somebody did contribute something that was good to one stage of the company that isn't even used anymore later. And the last point with this, and it's not as much for me, but having more people also increases liability. And in my case, I've always worked with people that I trust a lot and that trust me. So that's not as much of an issue, but in a lot of markets, that could become a much bigger issue. Next startup was Hacker Coding Academy. That was a coding school that created a lot of win-win relationships. I graduated Dev Bootcamp and realized that there was a lot of short potential and the schools, how they were run, cost efficiency, student like structural. There's so many things that I could see done better. I resisted joining for a while because I had learned a lesson not to try to do too many things at once. Joined anyways because I was poor at the time, didn't have money, a backup income source, was offered free housing in a school that would also have housing, which was a synergy I saw in the school. And I realized that actually having an entrepreneurship background, a coding education background, and having attended a boot camp, I was a very good candidate to found this school. And so I did it against my better judgment. The initial most off-putting part of it was working with people who didn't get along with each other. And ultimately, though there were 3 founders, I was probably doing about 80-90% of the work because they would spend their time fighting, not having relevant skill sets, talking to lawyers about each other. It was really unproductive, and I figured that if I just buried my head and did all the work myself, it could work. I actually got the school together, hired teachers, got hundreds of students to apply, started monetizing, and we ended up losing the property because one of the founders who had gotten it had bought it below market rate, and the owner was trying to, it was like rent to own, was trying to kick people out so that he could resell the property for more money. But to me, when that happened, it was a good cue for me to abandon that project I never should have been involved with in the first place. And it was, again, the main part was working with people that I didn't 100% trust or that didn't totally get along with each other. That really broke that because it would have been a lot more productive otherwise. And also just even the sketchy nature of being able to lose a property is questionable. Another thing that I think learning from that, it didn't cause this school to fail, but it's something I really would have paid more attention to and was a problem from diverting attention to multiple things at once, working on Nouveau while living in a hacker house that was starting a coding school, was when I was hiring teachers, I made sure that they knew what they were talking about and were competent, but I sort of assumed they knew how to teach, and I sort of made a curriculum based on logic instead of experience. And what would have been better is testing their ability to teach as well as their ability to code and taking more time to vet people, which I would have done more if I had more time to dedicate towards this instead of trying to run 2 companies at once. Another side of that is that having experience teaching, I've taught at a few EC schools, summers to hundreds of children over the years. I should have taught the first phase of the curriculum myself to get a feel, to update my skill set and to get a feel for what the curriculum's like and how it works, and then use that personal experience to pass on to others. And that's a common theme in entrepreneurship, is you do the first things yourself until you know how to do them, and then it makes it easier to manage in the future. So that's a couple of points, is work with people you trust and that get along with each other, and also don't split your attention and really work through a lot of the experience yourself, even if it's in a minor role, before delegating that to other people, because you'll be a lot better with it and a lot more relevant. The last startup, and this is the one that I'm working on right now, is Gametree. And the mistakes I've made so far with it are knowing myself. I tend to work much better in teams than individually. I can work individually competently, but in school I always got higher grades on group papers and group projects, not because I was a mooch, but just the way my brain works and efficiency and delegating and understanding people. And even in sports, anything like that, I'd always do very well whenever there's team dynamics and team strategies that come together. And knowing that about myself, I should have gotten a more committed or better co-founder earlier on in the process, because it would have helped me with a lot of brainstorming. I think better talking to people and thinking out loud. And I also would have gotten a lot more work done, or we would have, because it's a force multiplier, especially early on. If you add one person when there's a few people, it's not as big of a difference as if there's one person suddenly adding an extra. That's double the amount of work that can get done. You cost some in communication, but you make that back up in brainstorming. And the reason I didn't do that first is because I thought I knew the idea very well. I've been thinking about it for 4 years. This is the company that I've always been wanting to start. And I thought that I could just get it done at a simple stage. Then recruiting somebody once it had validated itself would be very easy. But I think it would have been better to actually start off in that phase, and it would have kept my motivation up a little bit stronger than it was initially. And the next lesson from that, and this is the last lesson I'm going to go over, is really honing in on an MVP. With Gametree, it's an app for recommending video games and people to play games with. Not just video games, but games in general. I started off wanting to build the whole product in a way that was very scalable and could be refined later. And I had a big scope. And if I had been brainstorming with somebody earlier on, I probably wouldn't have gone down this path, but I ended up writing unnecessary code, realizing later that my goal was actually to get just a demo that people could subscribe to with their email addresses to check out later, and most importantly, just to demonstrate to investors how an application works, its feasibility, that it can get traction without having to commit to building a whole thing. And instead of building an application that could scale to become big, I decided to actually redo the MVP. Some of the code was salvaged, but ultimately it was a more tight-knit experience with a higher quality but less comprehensive. And because of that lack of brainstorming and trying to get things done too quickly, that wasted a few more weeks of my time, which as a startup is much more significant than another company. Another way of saying all this is it's good to think through what you're going to do a lot more, especially at the MVP stage, because the stakes are higher. And they have the saying, measure twice, cut once, which sort of applies, where it's good to have somebody to brainstorm with, but also it's good to think through the exact features and how what you're capable of doing and what you are doing really aligns with your goals, because twice as much time spent thinking will save you more time later changing a product. The main takeaways from all of this, from the failures that I've had as an entrepreneur, the biggest ones, the themes that that apply to me, are taking some time for caution with red cups primarily, backing up data, using established services, things like GitHub. It's a minor point nowadays, but that was something that absolutely killed what could have been a very successful company. And entrepreneurs by their nature tend to be more risk-taking and fast-moving. And so if you're like me, that's something to consider. Don't put all your eggs in one basket without protecting that basket. Another thing is to have co-founders. If it's a lot of incubators and investors won't even look at a company unless there's multiple co-founders. And there's a reason for that. You get twice as much work done with 2 people. You think through ideas a lot more clearly. At this point, I would be hesitant to ever start a company again without having co-founders ahead of time before I even start working on it, besides just the idea conception phase. And alongside that is working with and interviewing people and really vetting who you'd really like to work with. My girlfriend spent 2 years working on a birth clinic, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, and had a partner back out, and then got another partner who got pregnant, and then eventually the project she just gave up on because it's so much work that it requires multiple people, and the co-founder in her case was the most important issue. And I've found that to be something very similar for myself with Red Cups, with sales, with Nuvo, with having a fashion or technical expert earlier on, Hacker Coding Academy, having more people who are actually being productive than just me, and with Gametree, it hasn't really killed the company, and I'm working on it early on now, but I would be further along if I had been starting something like that sooner. So having co-founders is very important, and being very discerning about who those people are, making sure they're not going to walk out, as with happened with my girlfriend that killed the deal, or that they're people that you get along with or that complement your skills. Another thing, this isn't a lesson that I got from the other ones, but it's something I've noticed that I want to share, is having a routine from habits. People are often defined by their habits, physical fitness, how tired or energy you feel from how you eat. And getting in a habit of working is a lot more powerful than just working sporadically or here and there. It's nice to have the convenience of working from home or from being able to work when you feel like it, but it's really a habit that creates the most productive work environment. And I've noticed that if I wake up and meditate 15 minutes, those mornings I get more work done across the board every time. And I don't know if it's actually the 15 minutes of meditation or if it's starting off with the discipline to do something or what the intent that says, but it's something I notice after the fact, and that means it's actually more valuable than meditating to get that productivity and then associating that as the cause before the fact. And another lesson to sum up is focusing on one thing at a time. Gametree is the main thing I'm working on right now. I teach people how to code for like part-time for income, which makes it so I don't have to stress or bring on other large projects like I did with Hacker Coding Academy and being poor while working on Nuvo. But putting all my energy into Gametree, and that's where most of my thought goes, makes me a lot more charged about it, a lot more passionate. I think about it a lot more often, and you come out with a lot more high-quality things than if your attention is split between a lot of stuff. And the last point, and this is one that was most relevant to Nuvo, is make non-cash equity and vest a lot more slowly than immediately or half up front like I'd had in Nuvo, 2 to 4 years at least, and that way you won't get bogged down, have a huge cap table, which is a turnoff to investors, demotivating to yourself and other people. So again, just to wrap up, those are a lot of lessons that I learned as an entrepreneur, and hopefully by seeing my psychology and how I work, you can put a lot of those lessons into context and across different startups, how that they phase out and how those things are applying now to Gametree. And hopefully you won't have to experience a lot of the failures I have had, and that'll make you a wiser, more capable entrepreneur in the future. And I wish you luck, and I'm curious to hear what you guys are working on and how any of those experiences that I've had can help you, and if those have impacted you at all.